Howdy, howdy, howdy out there in podcast world. This is Tony Denton coming to you again from the Phoenix, Arizona area on May 20th, 2019. It's it's 74 degrees outside today. Blue skies, white clouds, and it's supposed to be pretty nice like this for the next week or so, which is a little unusual for May in the Phoenix area. Anyway, we're on installment 18 in my audiobook series on my book Hebrews, From Flawed to Flawless Fulfilled. If you're following along in your copy of my book, page 133, we're on Hebrews chapter 7, verses 20 through 28. In chapter 7, 1 through 10, based on the premise that Jesus is our high priest after the order of Melchizedek, chapter 6, verse 20, Paul wrote about the greatness of Melchizedek's priesthood, even over Aaron's priesthood that God himself set up. Yes, God established both priesthoods, but one was greater than the other. In chapter 7, verses 11 through 19, Paul wrote about how the priesthood of Jesus Christ superseded the priesthood of Levi. And now, in verses 20 through 28 of chapter 7, the reader finds Paul's explanation for this substitution. In a nutshell, this passage of Scripture demonstrates that the priesthood of which Jesus is our high priest is much superior to the priesthood of which Aaron was a priest because of what Jesus accomplished through it, the redemption of man, that which the Levites could never accomplish. The two basic arguments are as follows. Number one, unlike the Levites, Jesus was made high priest by an oath from God. Number two, unlike the Levites, neither Jesus nor his priesthood will ever need to be replaced. They're timeless. So let's start looking at verses 20 through 28 by reading verses 20 and 21. Inasmuch as he was not made priest without an oath, for they have become priests without an oath, but he with an oath by him who said to him, The Lord has sworn and will not relent, which means to renege. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. God took oaths in order to indicate the unchangeableness of things that he had set in order, Hebrews 6:17, which teaches two things. Number one, since the Levites became priests apart from any oath by God at all, then God never meant for that priesthood to be everlasting. Without an oath from God, it could be and was changed, chapter 7, verse 12. On the other hand, number two, since, as Paul wrote here, as well as in chapter 6, 18 through 20, God did swear an oath concerning Christ's priesthood, then it, unlike the Levitical priesthood, is eternal, unchangeable. Why did God swear concerning Jesus, but not concerning Levi or his posterity? Because they weren't chosen based on their morality and spirituality, but merely on their lineage. Jesus and his priesthood, however, were established by an oath of God based on his character and nature. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 10. Verse 22, by so much more, or by which, Jesus has become, and of course is, a surety for a better covenant. The word for surety, engus, E-G-G-U-O-S, which is pronounced E-N-G-U-O-S, engus, refers to a guarantor, or one who makes sure the covenant is carried out on the part of both parties involved. Here's an interesting fact about this term. All 5 Greek terms in Strong's exhaustive concordance that begin with EGG, or ENG as it would be for us, are related to the hand, that part of your body called the hand, something close by. Notice the following. EGGIZO, to make near, to be at hand. EGGRATEO, to engrave, inscribe, write with the hand. EGGUOS, limb, such as the hand. Pledged, such as by handshake. EGGUS, at hand, near, nigh, ready. Lastly, EGGUTERON, comparative adjective, nearer, closer, at hand. See all the words related to EGG or ENG, engus, mean something close at hand. What's the point? It's obvious that the etymology of this term carries with it the idea that whatever was and is being guaranteed was and is something that would soon occur, at least within the lifetime of the recipient, implying, of course, that it was future, that it hadn't yet arrived. To bring it all together, it could read like this: because Jesus was made high priest by an oath from God, he's the chosen guarantor of a soon-to-arrive better covenant, an at-hand covenant. In other words, it has not arrived yet when Paul wrote Hebrews in AD 63. And we'll get more into that when we get to chapter 10, verse 9. The word covenant in this verse, verse 22, actually refers to an arrangement made by a superior for the benefit of an inferior. In other words, because of Jesus, God's people today are under a much better arrangement than the Jews were under Moses. Speaking about Christ and his priesthood being established as endless and consistent by an oath from God, Paul went on in the next two verses to expand upon this thought. Verse 23, and there were, or have been, many priests, because they were, are being in the original, because they are being prevented by death from continuing. Two initial important side notes. Number one, this statement is actually in the present tense in the original, indicating that the Levitical priesthood was still being practiced by the Jews at the time of Paul's writing. And number two, since it's the high priesthood of Jesus that's under consideration, Paul, by his use of the word priests here, was evidently alluding specifically to the high priests. So his point was this: whereas death kept any Aaronic high priest from remaining a priest forever, Jesus, who received his priesthood after his resurrection, is no longer subject to death. According to Robert Milligan in his 19th century commentary on the Epistle to the Hebrews, Phinehas ben Samuel was the 81st and last high priest between AD 67 and 70. Since 81 is the sacred number 3 squared, then squared again, that is third to the fourth power, this suggests that the fullness of God's intention for the old priesthood system was completed at Jerusalem's destruction, AD 70. Occasionally people hear about an illegal handling of a will. However, since Jesus not only wrote and died for his will, but was also resurrected to probate it himself, he's without doubt the perfect high priest. Verse 24, but he, because he continues forever, has an unchangeable priesthood. Check out Revelation 1:18 with that. In verse 8, Paul spoke of the Levitical priesthood as mortal, being yoked to ancestry and posterity. But in verse 16, he spoke of the Melchizedekian priesthood, Christ's priesthood, as immortal, having no yoke to ancestry and posterity. The word unchangeable was used at the end of a legal contract and meant that it was valid and, unlike the contract with the Israelites through Moses, unalterable, something that should have provided them a confidence unlike they had ever experienced. This word also carries with it the idea of something that cannot be stepped across or into, meaning that it can neither be destroyed nor transferred. As Paul later said, Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever, chapter 13, verse 8. Meaning that while under the Levitical priesthood one might have a pleasant moral priest one day and an unpleasant immoral priest the next, Jesus was, is, and always will be the same kind of priest and with no successors. Verse 25, therefore he is also able to save to the uttermost those who come to God through him, since he ever lives to make intercession for them. The word for uttermost means completely or perfectly. In other words, Jesus, as our eternal high priest, doesn't just roll sins forward for a year as the Old Testament high priests did, chapter 10, 1 through 3. He forgives them forever, remembering man's sins against him no more, chapter 10, verse 17. The drawing near to God in verse 19 is defined here in verse 25 by Paul as coming to God through Christ. As Jesus himself said, no one comes to the Father except through me, John 14:6. The word for intercession actually refers to everything Jesus has done and is doing even now as regards our salvation. Today the word is pretty much limited to prayer, but this wasn't the case with the Greek word 2,000 years ago. Verse 26, for such a high priest was fitting for us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and has become higher than the heavens. Verses 26 through 28 of chapter 7 of Hebrews provide a sketch of the ideal priest. A priest who isn't just better than Aaronic priests, but even better than Melchizedek, whom Paul left behind at this point, focusing on the perfection of Jesus, his priesthood, and his covenant. Jesus, who continues forever and has an unchangeable priesthood, is the fitting high priest for man because only he can therefore save to the uttermost. Besides, he's holy, harmless, and undefiled. The Old Testament background for the original term for holy describes a person whose relationship to God was based on covenant faithfulness. It described one who genuinely fulfilled not only the external but also the heart expectations of the covenant. Such a man was all God wanted him to be. Jesus, having been perfectly loyal in covenantal obedience and having lived a life of perfect integrity, became everything God wanted him to be for man. While the term holy brings to mind Christ's relationship to the Father, the term for harmless brings to mind the idea of Christ's relationship to his fellow man. For instance, even when he cleansed the temple and was wrongly executed, he harmed no one, 1 Peter 2:23. While the active term for harmless brings to mind Christ's relationship to his fellow man, the passive word for undefiled brings to mind his relationship to evil. In other words, Jesus wasn't contaminated by his association with sinners. Thus the phrase holy, harmless, and undefiled describes Jesus spiritually, morally, and religiously. Further, Jesus is separate or distinct from sinners, not only because he's without sin, chapter 4, verse 15, holy, harmless, and undefiled, but also because he has become higher than the heavens, meaning that, unlike the Aaronic high priests, Jesus sits at the right hand of the very throne of God. Check out chapter 8, verse 1. In chapter 4, verse 14, Paul said that Jesus had passed through the heavens, and in Ephesians 4, verse 10, he wrote that Jesus is far above all the heavens that he might fulfill all things. Ephesians 4:10 was written in the subjunctive future tense because at the time of Paul's letter to Ephesus, Jesus had yet to finish fulfilling all things. Even though Jesus came in the likeness of sinful flesh, Romans 8:3, received and ate with sinners, Luke 15:1 and 2, and was a friend to sinners, Matthew 11:19, he remained separate and dissimilar from them in that he didn't participate in their evil deeds. Verse 27. Jesus does not need daily, as those high priests, to offer up sacrifices, first for his own sins and then for the people's. For this he did once for all when he offered up himself. The word for daily is from two terms which could literally be translated as day by day. And since the word day was often used to denote any part of time, meaning that the phrase could mean from time to time, then it should be understood in relation to Paul's other statements about the high priestly sacrifices. Later in Hebrews, Paul accurately spoke of how high priests offered sacrifices once a year, chapter 9, verse 7, or year by year, chapter 10, verse 1. In fact, in Exodus 13:10, scholars are forced to see that day by day is a Jewish idiom. Check out Matthew 12:40 in relation to that, which should actually be translated as year by year. So one could read this to say that Jesus doesn't need, from time to time, whether daily, monthly, or annually, to offer up sacrifices. This statement here in verse 27 teaches at least three things. Unlike the Aaronic priests, chapter 5, verse 3, Jesus didn't and doesn't need to offer a sacrifice for himself, but only for the people. Number two, unlike the Aaronic priests, Jesus doesn't offer a sacrifice annually, but he did so once for all people of all time. In other words, he doesn't need to be re-sacrificed every week. Speaking of Christ's sacrifice in chapter 9, 25-28, Paul wrote, "Not that he should offer himself often, as the high priest enters the most holy place every year with blood of another. He then would have had to suffer often since the foundation of the world. But now, once at the end of the ages, he has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many." And number three, unlike the Aaronic priests, Jesus offered not a calf or a goat, but himself for the people. Chapter 9, verse 14. The following verse sums up the last few verses and provides a transition for chapter 8 verse 1 through chapter 10 verse 18. Verse 28. For the law appoints as high priests men who have weaknesses, but the word of the oath, which came after the law, appoints the Son who has been perfected forever. Being human, Levitical Aaronic high priests, and therefore their priesthood, were just weak in general. So, while the law constituted morally, spiritually, physically weak men, that is, men subject to death, as high priests, God's declaration and oath, which followed the law, constituted his perfected Son as high priest. Note, this verse again connects Christ's priesthood with his sonship to God, that is, to his deity. So, unlike the Old Testament high priests, Jesus is the high priest who suits man's needs perfectly. Okay, that's my thoughts, my comments on those verses. But now we will go to page 313 in the book to read my translation of verses 20 through 28. And who wasn't made a high priest without an oath? There are indeed those who've become priests without a sworn oath. But there's a priest with an oath sworn by the one who said of him, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest throughout the age in the order of Melchizedek." So Jesus has become our pledge of an imminent and better covenant. Besides, due to being prevented by death from carrying on their service, there have been many successive priests. But Jesus, because he'll be living throughout the age, will maintain his priesthood permanently, without any successors. And consequently, since he's always alive to arbitrate for those who come to God through him, he's able to completely save them, not merely roll their sins forward once every year. He's what we need, for he's loyal, equitable, undefiled, having not been counted among sinners, but having been exalted above the heavens. Unlike the Levitical high priests, he doesn't need to daily offer up sacrifices for his own sins before those of the people, for whom he offered himself once for all time. For the law ordains frail men as high priests, while the word of an oath subsequent to the law ordains a perfected Son as high priest throughout the age, which simply means forever and ever and ever. So, thank you for being with me again this week as we considered installment 18 about chapter 7 verses 20 through 28 of my commentary called Hebrews from Flawed to Flawless Fulfilled. I will see you again next week. Have a great week.